folks. Well, thank you for your patience as we, we're still kind of getting ready as you came in. And it looks like we've got the closed captioning functioning and everything is ready to go with our slideshow. So let me go ahead and proceed with our introductions. So my name is Christine Woods, and I will be moderating this session. And Maria Santos is our host, and she has all of the questions and things like that for tonight. So before we get started, I do have a few reminders. Please keep in mind that this session is being recorded and will be made publicly available, probably through the library YouTube and probably through the Accessibility Services Office of Accessibility Services. And then now I think it's kind of nice when we're having a discussion for everybody to have their video on, but we want people to feel comfortable, so you don't have to turn your video on. Sometimes it just helps to be able to see faces and interpret, facial expressions, but that is definitely not required. Next, we do want to try to keep the mics muted. And then if you have questions during the session, use the raise your hand little reaction feature. So take a moment now to look at your Zoom tools and make sure you see that. It's usually along the bottom of the screen. And sometimes if you have the screen minimized, you don't see it. So just take a look and see if you see that reaction tool now, and then you can raise your hand first. And then we should be running this session for about an hour. If we're really having a good time, we might continue just a little past that, but otherwise we'll try to finish up about 8. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You can also use the chat feature if you'd like to share a comment, but you don't want to interrupt anybody because the conversation is flowing or something like that. You could also, or if you feel more comfortable using the chat feature, you could also use that. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Maria Santos, our leader for tonight, our discussion leader.
Hey everybody, my name is Maria. I'm so happy to be here where we'll be discussing Judy Heumann's memoir, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights advocate. When the library asked us to have a book discussion, Dr. Bailey and I immediately thought of Judy Heumann's memoir. For a little bit of context, Judy Heumann is really one of the prominent leaders of the disability rights movement. And it was just an absolute joy to read her perspective and her account of such a significant civil rights movement. So I put together a little slideshow to aid our discussion tonight. The slideshow, on the left-hand side of the slideshow, there's the cover of the book, Being Human. And the cover of the book is Judy Heumann sitting in the wheelchair that she uses, looking at herself in the mirror. And the captioning on this slide says, Recharge with Reading, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights advocate. So our first discussion question, Heumann's memoir can seem to take place in a different country completely to those who do not know or remember the pre-504 era. So what specifically stood out as surprising now that we have passed 504 and we live in this sort of country where we have accessibility laws, where we have buildings that are designed to be accessible? I think it's something that stood out to me. And I'm sorry if this ages some people, but for somebody like me who was born after 504, it's hard to wrap my mind around this country being designed in a way that's so inaccessible. So I wanted to hear from the group what stood out in this as surprising or shocking about society before 504 was passed. So does anybody have any thoughts about that?
I forgot to mute myself, so I'll go ahead and stay unmuted. And I forgot to raise my hand ahead of time. So I'm going to go ahead and chime in though. Yeah. Right about the time that Judy Heumann was starting school, that was almost the exact same time that I was starting school. So our ages are similar. And I absolutely do not remember having people that had disabilities in my classes until 5th grade. And a very, very good friend of mine, like almost like my best friend, he went blind due to an illness, and it was sudden, and it was, it wasn't like a disability that he had from birth or anything like that. And all of the things that we did as a class to help him, and the different books for the blind that came to him that were in Braille, getting his textbooks in Braille. He had a special like tape recorder thing that would play the textbooks slower or faster, and some, special equipment like that. And just what a big change in everything it was to have that happening. And that was probably late 70s. So now all of a sudden I can't remember exactly when that was passed. But because I had that interaction at a fairly young age, it just never occurred to me that it was never like that, and it gave me such a heartache to hear about, the struggles and what she went through. So, but I did think it was very interesting to read about that part.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's hard to imagine a very real time in our country where schools were segregated because there was no law making or requiring schools to be accessible. So yeah, just going through school and having this notion, this failed and discriminatory practice of separate but equal in quotation marks. That was a very real time described in the book that I thought was so interesting as somebody who never grew up in a school system like that. And another question I have on the screen that, if for some of us who may have especially difficult time wrapping our minds around, what Judy Heumann described in the book as pre-504 era. A follow-up question to that on the screen is also, what would St. Leo look like today if 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act wasn't passed?
See, I don't see any hands raised at this point. So does anybody want to just unmute themselves instead of waiting for your hand to go up? We have a shy group tonight. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the places that Judy described in her book, where she said, just a slight curb was such a barrier, that she could not get over, that kind of, even if it wasn't like a huge curb that we're thinking of, but even if it was just like a slight, raised surface, how hard it was for her to get up. And also, we take for granted now buildings like, libraries and the buildings that, have multi-levels now have elevators, and it's, and it's a law that you have to have an elevator, and how hard that would have been, if we still just had stairs to every building, and we didn't have ramps, or the, as you go down the sidewalk, you have a ramp that goes down and then a ramp on the other side that goes back up, and things like that we kind of take for granted now. I think without 504, we would still be living in that world, because those adjustments took a lot of money. And without it being a law, I don't think different institutions and places would have businesses and things like that would want to spend the money if they didn't have to. So I think it's really a really good thing that we have that now.
I think we would have a lot of institutionalized people too. Like they would be, they would just go to a specific building that was designed just for them. So we would go back to a pseudo segregation, if you will, you know, where they can't be in the places where able-bodied people go. So they can't climb stairs, they can't go up more than one floor. Our lawns and things like that would not be accessible. It would just be a huge segregation problem again for people with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I know 504, I think, is focused more on like buildings, infrastructure, and accessibility. But as far as the ADA, I feel like our faculty, you know, definitely would not be aware of accommodations and how to accommodate students, you know, in terms of helping them be successful in their degree programs based on whatever kind of accommodations they would need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, same words are resonating with me as well, which are, you know, segregation and a lack of community. I think also it would be impossible for us to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, if it's not an accessible service, we're not going to have human diversity. It's not going to be equitable, and we're not really an inclusive community. So, yeah, our DEIJ efforts would be non-existent if it weren't for these important pieces of legislation. Absolutely. Great. Well, if nobody else has their hand up, I can go to the next slide. On page 13, Judy tells the story of a young boy asking her in her neighborhood while she was out and about if she was, quote, sick. After reading how this affected Heumann, how do you think our words affect our community members with disabilities?
Since we have such a small group participating, if you do, just unmute and speak up. Sorry. I mean, I think sometimes even if we don't mean to, we can say the wrong thing. You know, maybe it's not as overt as this specific example, but I think words are definitely hurtful. And even when we try to say things the right way or you know, do the right thing, you know, we can make mistakes. I think we just have to be ready to own up to it and be genuine and say, you know, if I said that wrong, please forgive me, or, you know, maybe help me on how to express, you know, or how you would like to talk about this, or, you know, those kinds of things. I think asking the people themselves can be a great tool. And I think Judy mentions that several times in her writing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, Brene Brown has this great quote when it comes to speaking and learning about communities that are different from her. And the quote is, "I am here not to be right, but to get it right." And I think having that mentality of, you know, teach me the right things to say, teach me disability etiquette, teach me disability culture, having that humble attitude is a great place for us to start, here at St. Leo, in order to create that more inclusive environment in not just the ways that we speak, but just the ways that we're having conversations about accessibility on our campus in general. All right. I'm going to move on to the next question. Heumann on page 21 states that nobody, not the teachers, not the principals, not the New York City Board of Education, expected the special ed kids to learn. Many didn't expect us to progress from elementary school to middle school, high school, university. What expectations does society have for people with disabilities? And what are our expectations for our students with disabilities at St. Leo?
These are all such great questions, Maria. You're just knocking it out of the park. This is so great because I loved reading this book, but it's so wonderful to be able to talk about it and, just learn more, hopefully, from each other. And I really appreciate you putting these awesome questions together.
Yeah, of course. I love that this book, Judy Heumann is such a monumental figure, especially when we think about the 504 sit-ins where she led, in recorded American history, longest sit-in protest of a federal building in our history. And what I love about the book is that all the things she's talking about through her life, through those huge civil rights movements that she led, are applicable to our St. Leo community. Those same lessons of inclusion, letting people speak, raising expectations can be applied here at St. Leo.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking again of, my friend that was blind, and he was with me all the way through middle school and high school and went on to university and became a lawyer. And I never thought twice about it. It just shows that when Judy was talking about the children at a young age where they interacted with each other, they played games together, they kind of worked out their own way of doing things, how great it is when we work with children at a young age to understand these issues. I think it can really make a difference and open their eyes, hopefully, for in the future. But I think sometimes our expectations are not what they should be, right? We're still learning. We're still hopefully improving and getting better all the time. And hopefully we're going to see some improvements in that area.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I work with students in my office, a lot of times I hear things like, I never knew I would be able to go to college. Or I hear parents say, like, I didn't even know this was a possibility. And I think that comes from a lot of societal norms of, oh, your student with a disability can't go to college. That's not going to be an option. Or your student with a disability can't work in this dream career, this dream field. And Judy Heumann's a great example of how, she was literally told in grade school, you can't come to this public school because you're a fire hazard. And then she was told after she graduated, oh, you can't be a teacher because you use a wheelchair. So it's constantly confronting society's expectations and challenging those and saying, no, I can do those things. Reasonably being accommodated is my civil right, and I can do those things. So having that sort of mentality rather than just that no mentality is something I'm really happy that she highlighted in the book.
I'm going to throw this out there. This is not one of your questions, but do you feel like sometimes physical disabilities are treated different from disabilities that are more hidden, as far as like, different kinds of abilities that, I'm trying to think of how to say it, but
invisible disabilities.
yes, thank you. Okay, let's
Yeah.
say it. Yeah. Because I worked with a teacher who had autism,
Mhm.
and she was very proactive about talking to the rest of the faculty and even her students about, you know, her interactions and why she might react this way or a different way, or, you know, it was an awesome experience. Sadly, I mean, and she was a pretty good friend of mine. She passed away. And I think it was just so awesome that she was a teacher, you know, what a great experience for the children that had her as a teacher, to learn more about that, you know, and how Judy paved the way, right? If she hadn't fought over becoming a teacher, then my friend wouldn't have been able to be a teacher, you know? So it's just a great example. And I think it was harder for her because it wasn't a disability that people could really see. It was more about, you know, how she might react or not react to certain things, or not want to be touched, or, you know, there were just certain things that she would try to help explain. And, you know, I think those are the areas where in society, sometimes we do need, like we talked about, like we need help. We need people with disabilities to explain to us what, you know, we can do to make things better for them. And I was just so privileged to have her in my life.
Yeah, I absolutely, you know, something that's really common in our office that we hear from students who have invisible disabilities. We hear it so often than not. I didn't know I could get accommodations for blank, you know, whether that be ADHD, autism, a mental health disorder, which falls, you know, the ADA defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more daily life functions. And a lot of people don't know that. They think that the ADA is just for people who have physical disabilities or visible disabilities, you know, and not others. In fact, the ADA actually doesn't even have a list of disabilities. It's just that broad definition. So a lot of times in society, when through media, when we see disability, it's depicted by somebody who has a physical or visible disability. So we don't really even think invisible disability. And I think that primes people with invisible disabilities to think that their disability doesn't matter or isn't protected or doesn't need accommodations. So I definitely think that that's a, you know, a matter of representation, and how that you know has a huge impact, that visibility and representation, and how we view disability, for sure.
I think things have gotten a lot better. I grew up in the 80s in New York, and I just remember being in class, and then you would see special ed classes, and they would be kind of marginalized. And we had no idea. It was kind of a mystery what was going on with them. So we felt like they were different and not included in the quote unquote norm. So I think that a lot of strides have been made, and also with bullying and everything that goes along with that, I think things are much better these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, when we're talking about the significance of 504, desegregating schools, I think that, you know, when we have schools that are segregated like pre 504, it also, like you says, when you're a child and you see other students going to other classes that are kind of hidden, it and you're not interacting with people who are different than you, it leads to coming up with prejudice. It comes leading up with, you think, oh, there must be something quote wrong with those students, or why are those students separate? Rather than, you know, having those interactions of disabled children and non-disabled children coming together and learning from each other and seeing, you know, what is it like to be a student with a disability, rather than, you know, we're gonna, you know, in Judy's case, put the special ed kids in the basement, and they only get to come out a certain amount of times a week, and the non-disabled kids come and get to push their wheelchairs, and it was considered like charity work, you know? So it kind of set the stage for setting up, you know, prejudice and a lot of misconceptions about people with disabilities at a very young age. Yeah, great points. I'm gonna move on to the next question, because I think it really plays into this line of dialogue. One of Judy Heumann's most infamous quotes is, "I'm bitter about being handicapped, but not about having a disability." So after reading the memoir, or even just personal experience, having a disability or knowing somebody with a disability, what do you think she means when she says, "I'm bitter about being handicapped, I'm not about having a disability"?
This is Greg. To me, that means that she's saying that society is handicapping her and holding her back from being able to be successful, versus being upset or frustrated with her specific disability.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. You know, Judy Heumann, I can't remember if it's necessarily, you know, in this book, or if it was in one of the many interviews she gives, but she, you know, she makes it clear that she uses the term disabled person very intentionally, because she's pointing out the fact that she has been disabled by society more so than what her actual disability is. So yeah, and I think that's a really key point that she makes regularly, and is intentional with the language that she uses as identifying as a disabled person by society. You know, absolutely. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that quote?
I think being handicapped or called handicapped has been seen more as a negative word than having a disability in this society.
Mhm.
I think saying disability gives it more credence, if you will.
I think handicap is more overt, like to a degree you can see a handicap, and also a disability, but there are disabilities like learning disabilities, invisible disabilities, things that you can overtly see like outside externally, that could, you know, that could explain why she said, you know, I'm not bitter about being handicapped, but not about having a disability, because there may be some things that she can and cannot do that people can't see, that we would not know unless she didn't share that with us. I think one of the things too that, you know, that hurts people that are different or different abled or different races or whatever is that term of tolerance. You know, it used to be, I come from an education background, and it used to be that we very overly used the word being tolerant, teaching kids to be tolerant. But, you know, when you think about the word tolerance, it can have a negative connotation. So are we embracing people? Are we inviting people? Are we welcoming people? Or we're just tolerating the fact that they are who they are? And so, you know, when she says that, it makes me think of that. It makes me think that maybe she feels that people tolerate her to a degree because that's what we've been taught, but not necessarily because she's a person. She's a human being and maybe different abled than some of us, but we all have to a degree a handicap, if you will. You know, we don't really use that word in schools the term handicap, but I'm just saying when we look at it from the perspective of her.
Yeah, I love that point about tolerance, because that's something to, working with people who have disabilities, I hear often is, I go to I go to a building and only the bare minimum ADA requirements are met, or, people are making decisions about disability and accessibility services without including people with disabilities. So it sets the tone that, all right, we're providing these services because we legally have to, rather than we want to be an inclusive and diverse community and celebrate that diversity and what you bring, your perspective that you bring to the community. So yeah, I think that's a super important distinction between tolerating, abiding by the law, and being inclusive and celebrating diversity.
I think we missed the whole part of being intentional about, what we do. For example, when we have meetings in a very large room and we don't have closed captioning as a general rule, or we're passing the microphone around, but then it gets to someone that says, oh, I don't need the microphone because my voice is really loud. Like we ourselves are making the decisions and making assumptions that we are being welcoming, that we're being inviting. Just because you think you have a loud voice doesn't mean that if I have a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or whatever it is that, that I have, if I can't hear you, even if you think you have a loud voice, it's not all about just the loudness of the voice, but how the flexion and how the words are pronounced and how I can hear through, if I have hearing aids or some type of something to help me with my vision, or maybe I just need to read your lips, and it has nothing to do, or there's just so many things that I think when, that we just take for granted and then make assumptions for people, and we're not even people with the disability. Like, we're making the decisions for people. And I think that lends itself for that whole thing with tolerance, and it also lends itself for the assumption that we don't care. Like, it's all about what's comfortable for me, and not necessarily. So that's not how we build community, and that's not how we create welcoming environments, or that definitely is not an inclusion approach to, embracing people that, that have disabilities within our realm, and everything that you do. You started the whole conversation about what would we be if we didn't have 504. And that's why I said that, well, we wouldn't be a community. We would be exclusionary, we would be segregating, we would be doing all the things that we've worked so hard to overcome to not be. We would just go right back to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about, we say your example of, oh, I don't need a mic, or I don't need that, I'm loud enough. And it shows that, just like you were saying, and alluding to, we need to listen to people who have disabilities. We need to listen. And that's why it's so important to read books like Judy Heumann's Memoir, or watch the film that's very closely tied to this, Crip Camp, which she produced and stars in, and it's the documentary of the 504 sit-ins. A great example that I have for here on campus where, listening to a student who has a disability and including their feedback is true inclusion is, I'm in a building where it's a newer building, so it meets ADA requirements by law. But it's designed in such a way where it's meeting ADA requirements, but you can tell somebody who has never used a wheelchair or knows or listened to somebody who uses a wheelchair created certain bathrooms. And the result is now I work with a student very closely. He is a wheelchair user, and yeah, the bathroom technically meets ADA and 504 requirements, but it's not really truly accessible. And I think that's what happens when we don't listen to people who have disability and say, show me what's accessible for you, walk me through what would be best for you. Listening, like we're reviewing Judy Heumann's memoir. We're just kind of doing what we think is best, and we're not really truly being accessible in that story. So taking the time to listen, I think, is extremely crucial, and that's a very common theme that Judy talks about in the movie or in the book, is that she was, like her quote says, handicapped by people not listening, more so than the disability itself that she has. Does anybody else have any questions about this quote before we move on to the next question? I want to be mindful of everybody's time, although I'm loving the discussion and loving everybody's points. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next question. What preconceived notions about people with disabilities were challenged by the 504 protests? Just for context, from the book 504 protests, the longest protest occupation of a federal building in recorded history, 25 days. 25 days that this building was occupied in a peaceful protest until 504 was signed into law. So what preconceived notions about people with disabilities were challenged through this demonstration?
I don't want to be the only one that's talking, but no, I'm not the only one. You guys, it's been great to have so many people participating. I think it was that somebody with disabilities wouldn't be able to protest, just not even be able to be involved or care or, those kinds of things. I think there were a lot of preconceived notions that, maybe there would be other people that are advocating for him. Like she did talk a little bit about her mom, her dad, some things that they had done, that were kind of in protest. But that the people themselves would want to be there, that they were really getting involved and had a voice. I loved the way she described how some of the people that were involved were really literally putting their lives on the line because of support services and medicines and things that they needed that were cut off when they closed the building and wouldn't let people in and out, and were, causing a situation where they wanted to kind of starve them out. And I was just like, oh my God. I mean, that was just, I can't even imagine that somebody would just lock the door and then say, all right, you can go, but you can't come back in. I don't know. It was pretty tough to read that part. But I think those are the preconceived notions that especially people at that time have, but probably somewhat, continues today, that, that people aren't able to speak up for themselves. And I think we've got to encourage them and make sure that we are definitely listening and taking note and learning and getting better. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point that, a lot of the people who occupied this building and protested literally were putting their lives on the line. In the film Crip Camp, they go into even more detail about certain disabilities, no backup ventilators, people who needed to be rotated throughout the night in order to prevent bed sores, reusing no new catheters for individuals who needed to use catheters, no bathing. So yeah, those were serious hurdles that and barriers that those people put their lives on the line in order to protest. Absolutely. Is there anything else that stood out to anybody about the 504 protests?
I think maybe what's amazing about this is that I never learned about it. I did not know about these protests until the book. And Judy actually mentions that in the book as well, that she mentions that she's talked to lots of other people who are just like, there was a protest? What? Like, just that it's not something that's covered in history or in our, typical high school curriculum or anything like that. I mean, I don't know if there are some history classes and things maybe at the college level that do, but just in our typical, curriculum that's kind of American history, that these disability rights and things are not covered. And I think that they should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I teach intro to social work, and for our chapter on disability, I showed the film Crip Camp, which is tightly, very closely tied to Judy Heumann's memoir. And they get into live footage of what it was like. They set up, camps. It really was an occupation of a federal building. And my students were just blown away that this was a thing, that they had never been taught about these protests, that they had never been taught about the fact that America was not always accessible, that there weren't elevators, sidewalk dips, ramps, that it was totally legal to, not hire somebody on the basis of disability until 1990, and it is shocking that this was never spoken about in history, and that we're raising generation after generation who don't know about these protests or the significance of them. Just by a show of hands, if you want to use the raise hand feature, how many people were taught about the 504 protests and disability rights movement in K through 12? Anybody? No? Yeah, I think that's so.
Do you mean in the classroom, like as a student in a K-12
classroom?
classroom?
A student. Was that ever in the curriculum? Yeah.
No, and most of us educators, what we know about 504 is when kids or families request a 504 plan. Because, in schools, it's mostly IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and that's for learning disabilities, also some physical disabilities too, but mostly, any disability that adversely affects the learning of the student, then, becomes a student that we have to provide an individual education program to, that's unique and prescribed and very unique to the student's needs, and no one else's needs are considered except the one student. And the 504s are more, and I hate to say this because, it's not all, but many families would request a 504 for things like, diabetes but the thing was that they would only request the 504 accommodation when it was time for a standardized assessment, because through that, the student could then get some accommodations like extended time and, a smaller group and, all these things that you can get through a 504. But that wasn't accessible to a student on an individual education program because, IDEA is very specific to, the accommodations that we provide. And if you provide an accommodation for a standardized assessment, it can't just be made up the day before the assessment. It has to be an accommodation that was provided all along, because the student needs that to be able to learn. So, that's to the extent, I think, as educators that we talk about the 504 plans, because we have surface knowledge about it. But in terms of the curriculum, and like I was a high school teacher, I don't remember ever even having anything that had to do with 504s in the curriculum. And if it's there, it may have been very subtle, like just real brief and move on. Let's go and go into something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a very strong connection between what you're saying, that people typically have a very surface level of what 504 is, and they typically only associate it with 504 IEP plans in K through 12. I think that's directly related to the fact that we don't teach disability history, because if we were having these conversations, then students graduating high school would know that no, 504 is not just IEPs and K through 12. It's also the rest of your life. And ADA, you're covered under ADA for civil rights. That's civil rights legislation. So if we were to have these conversations and teach this history more often, I think people would be much more aware when they come to our community and higher education about what is accessibility services, what are your rights as somebody with a disability, and what is our legal and also our core value, obligations to inclusion. So having these conversations younger, I think, is really essential.
It can be one of those subjects that are supposed to not be, taught in the classroom, kind of like race and racism and, all those things that we hear about. But, there are many things that we could teach about disability and things that happen to children and people prior to any of these laws. I mean, if we go way back to when Geraldo Rivera was doing the Willowbrook, documentaries, those were like really stark examples, like almost like a shock. Like they had a shock value, right? Because of what you would see. I used the Willowbrook documentary when I was teaching an undergrad class on inclusion. And I mean, it's one of those areas that I'm saying, like, it's hard to talk about those things, but if we want to change history, we really need to see what it was like. So when you said at the beginning, what would we be if we didn't have 504? Well, we would have Willowbrook again. We would have all these things that we worked so hard to move away from, because it's because of 504, because of IDEA, because of all these things. And it's sad, to be honest with you, that we had to have law, something, because when you think of law, legal regulations, guidance, and things like that, it's like a forced thing, right? We do it because we have to do it, because it's compliance, because we can, in schools, you'll lose a lot of funding and you can't help kids and this and that. But, it's never been, this is what we do because people are important. It's always been, this is what we do because this is what we have to do. We're forced to do this. So, I mean, you're right, Maria, and Christine too. We could go on and on with conversations tonight, because this is a very important topic that has not gotten, it hasn't received or gotten the attention that it truly merits, that, we're not tolerating people because they're different than us. We're embracing people, we're respecting people for what they bring to the table, despite, whatever differences we may think they come to us with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Does anybody else have anything to add about 504 protests, preconceived notions that were challenged by that protest, before we move on to the next question? All right. This is, I believe, the last question of the night, and I wanted to leave this the last one because it's really open to everybody. And it's something that we could talk about all night if we all had the time. But after reading Judy Heumann's memoir and thinking about, her childhood, not having access to education because she was deemed a fire hazard and how that was totally legal, her being told not that she can't be a teacher because she's using a wheelchair and that was totally legal, and then not having civil rights legislations passed till 1990, not having federal architecture laws passed till 504 and 74. Keeping these things in mind, and just this history of the disability rights movement, and how we are getting to where we are today, where we're embracing diversity, embracing inclusion. What role do we play as individuals to make St. Leo a more accessible community?
I think it's sometimes just the little things that we forget. For example, if we're putting together materials for a class, do we have things like screenshots rather than have text that could be read by a machine readable text, computer assistive program kind of thing? And I don't know all the different technologies that are out there, but having things like the alt text, if we're posting a video, making sure that that it's been transcribed. And I've looked at some of the transcripts and sometimes they come out with weird words, right? So then you have to really go back in there and fix them. Depending on your accent and how you talk, sometimes things come out wrong. And then if the transcript's wrong, what kind of message are we sending to people that might be really relying on it? Making sure that learning materials are accessible for everybody. If we're asking students to participate and things like that, making sure, that they're able to. And also providing learning through different avenues, where if maybe they don't feel comfortable asking a question during a class that you have, but they would be willing to, meet with you later or something like that. So just offering different opportunities, meeting students where they are and not questioning it. Like, oh, well, I showed you that last night or whatever, like you have to be really open to meeting students where they are and making sure that you provide all those opportunities and handouts or whatever it is that you're providing, that they are in a format that's readable and things like that. So,
yeah, those are all really good, Christine. I had a student, I want to say 2 terms ago, that she didn't say anything to me. I did not know. But one day I just, because I teach special education, exceptional student education, that's my field. And, it's all related to disability. And, so I try to do things in my courses that show practical things that we can do in schools, in a classroom. So in one of the meetings, I turned on, in PowerPoint, you can turn on the closed captioning too, so that everything that I say, it appears on the screen. And she started crying. The student started crying. She shared, she talked to us, to the class, and shared how, how important she felt, how important that made her feel, that, that I cared enough to turn on a closed caption, and just without even knowing that she could potentially need closed captioning, because we talked about invisible disabilities, or disabilities that they're not overt, you can't see them. And just thinking about that's exactly what you were just talking about. The whole notion with students that don't write well, but give them the opportunity to present their material orally, and they're off the charts, right? In demonstrating the knowledge that they've acquired. Giving a student an assignment template, because the rubric can be a little bit complicated. So you break down the rubric in a template. Those are all things that really don't take a long time on our parts as professors, but that makes such a huge difference in the success of students, and across the university. It doesn't matter where you are, it makes a huge difference. So I think you're right, Christine. It's those subtle little things, those minor things that we see as minute, that can be huge for people that need those supports.
Those are great points. Does anybody else have any thoughts, feelings about how we as individuals can make St. Leo a more accessible and inclusive and diverse community when it comes to disability services?
Can I just add one more thing? I would love to see us have some type, in K-12, we have Special Olympics. And because a lot of times the students who do have a disability don't have the opportunity to participate in the extracurricular activities and sports and things like that. I would love to see us do something similar for our students to promote athletic events, very, very specific to accessibility, because they may not be able to be on basketball teams or soccer teams or things like that. But why couldn't we create it doesn't even have to be something permanent that St. Leo does, but at certain points of the year, like remember that, and then just put on events that are very specific to them. And then we, as people who, could be considered the outsiders that don't deal with the challenges of a disability, could then be the audience, the cheerleaders, the people that are really embracing and just, really rooting for the kids, for our students. Because I know that we have a lot of students at St. Leo that are not able to do all the sporting events that we have. And that's a big, big deal, and a big, a contributor to holistic, education for all of our students at St. Leo. It's not just all the academics, but all the other, things that are extracurricular that build and strengthen the experiences that they have in our university.
I absolutely love that point. In fact, for Disability Awareness Week this year, we partnered with Special Olympics and Division of Blind Services to host an interactive beep baseball event. For anybody who's unfamiliar with beep baseball, it's an adaptive form of baseball for people who are blind or have visual related disabilities. It was actually great. We actually, Greg was a huge part in organizing that. Shout out to Greg. Taught our fantastic baseball and softball teams how to participate, and it was actually broadcasted. It was a partnership with athletics, so it was broadcasted as an event, and then we got blindfolds for students, so that way after watching the proper demonstration of the game, students were allowed to participate themselves to get a feel of the sport and learn and get involved with Special Olympics. And that's something that we're in discussions about making a regular yearly thing. I think we might pitch it as, quote, spring training, as a yearly spring event. Because, it was great to see students come out who may have had disabilities or who are non-disabled come and be so interactive and really give that sport the respect and audience it deserves. We're doing it on an athletic field, on our athletic broadcast with student athletes. So giving it the stage and respect that the sport deserves is huge. And I'm so excited that, hearing you talk about how that's a great idea, that there's also people in the community who see our vision for inclusion, and that includes extracurriculars and things outside of the classroom, not just the bare minimum, really putting on events that are rich and robust and fruitful. So yeah, does anybody else have any ideas or thoughts on what we can do to make St. Leo more inclusive community before we sign out for the night? Oh, I did see something in the chat. Oh yeah. Oh, anything else before we sign off tonight? I'm so happy we had this conversation.
This was wonderful. It shouldn't just be during Disability Awareness Month or week or whatever. It should be like an ongoing, like it should be what we do with anything else, and we should always be having these conversations. Part of trying to build our, our university as a place of excellence. This is part of it. We cannot be excellent if we're not inclusive of everyone that is a member of our university community.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this. I loved it.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a short survey for everybody to fill out that Christina has put together. So if you would like to fill that out, that would be absolutely fantastic to help with their data collection. So please, by all means, fill that out. I'm so happy everybody came. If you ever have questions about accessibility services, how you can keep your services in your department accessible in your unique area, please give accessibility services a call. You can always email me at any time. You can email our office at adaoffice@stleo.edu. And our office is really here to serve the students, but also to always serve our faculty and staff. So if you ever have any questions, comments, concerns, we are always available to answer your questions, problem solve, and collaborate on accessible events, programming, and materials.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Christine. You guys were awesome. You did a fantastic job.
Thanks, Georgina. And I'll either myself or Mike will reach out to you about spring training and
Thank you.
baseball for the future.
Please do. I'm all about it. I'll be right there with you.
Awesome.
We had a lot of folks from the library that participated. So it was a great partnership, and we just need to get more students to come to this kind of event.
Maybe if they see us being, doing it and really like talking it up, they'll want to come too. They get excited. We just have to find that little spot that motivates them and excites them, and we can get them out there.
Yep, absolutely.
Right, have a good night, you guys.
So much.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everybody.
much. Have a great night.
Signing off. Bye, Maria. Thank you for all your hard work.
Of course, I'm gonna stop share here. And all right, thank you so much. And thanks to Greg for joining in. We were happy to have you.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks. Really enjoyed it, guys. This was awesome.
Great.
Okay. We'll do it again soon. We'll think of something else. Okay.
Yeah,
Definitely.
sounds good.
Awesome.
Great night.
Alrighty. Good
All
night.
right. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. I'll share the video with you.